My guest today is Mr. Gall Beckerman. He is an editor at the New York Times Book Review. He is also the author of The Quiet Before on the Unexpected Origins of Radical Ideas. Hello, Gall.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about movements and about changing the world and reformist efforts and all these different things. One of the issues that you keep coming back to in the book is that of incubation. That seems to be a prime element in successful movements. What is incubation and why is it important?
Right. So I kind of took this word incubation, which I fear has been sort of co-opted by Silicon Valley in terrible ways, but I'm taking it back because I think it's actually really useful. And the idea of incubation is that in order for an idea, a radical idea, something that's going to completely upend a status quo, something that part of our reality that we've become so used to we don't think about it anymore. In order for that to be upended, in order for that idea to kind of emerge, you need a small, kind of hot, intimate space where people can really hash things out. They can dream together, debate one another, without fear of being shamed, propose other ideas, challenge one another. They're refining the radical quality of their ideas before it can get out into the world. So that when it does, so that when the protest happens, so that when people are in the streets, that it actually can lead to real change. It's the place where ideology is hammered out. It's the place where maybe there's an organizational structure to a movement is figured out, where people refine who they are and what they want to try to achieve.
So all of that makes sense to me.
Yes.
My immediate follow-up to that is you were describing kind of the classic coffee house, salon,
absolutely,
back of the room pub where the activists go and hang out and argue and go, no, damn it, Rousseau was wrong. Social media, on the other hand, seems to be, I'm on the toilet. I might as well retweet this thing. Like, I'll do this before I go back to work. How does social media militate against that incubation?
Right. No, I mean, not just that, not just I'll just retweet this thing, but think about the features of social media. Think about the features that a platform like Twitter or Facebook have. When I say features, I mean, every medium we use has certain qualities to it. And it's not just my sense. I mean, this is like Marshall McLuhan, starting in the 60s. Those theorists kind of really came to understand that the medium that we use really affects the way we think and the kinds of conversations we can have. And so my notion, which I did not invent, is that it opens up certain conversations and it absolutely forecloses other sorts of conversations. So social media is a medium that, McLuhan would call it hot. It moves very fast. It is, it tends toward, or it wants, kind of loud, bombastic exclamation. You're looking essentially, the game on a Facebook or a Twitter is to gain followers. So how do you gain followers? You say the most exciting thing, and we all know this when it comes to our personal lives, right? This is not a mystery. The problem is when you extend that sort of mode of communicating to movements, it can really be detrimental because on the one hand, it does something really great that we've never been able to do before as human beings in all of human history, which is you can get a few 100,000 people to the square or to the city streets in a matter of no time with just your phone, right? That is incredible. But on the other hand, that is, you have a bullhorn, right? You have a very, very effective bullhorn, but a bullhorn is not good for the incubation. A bullhorn actually undermines that process of incubation. And so the argument of the book, in a way, is looking at the last 10, 15 years of movements and saying that, we've become really enamored with this bullhorn. And it means that we've forgotten that there are other ways that we should be communicating in order to make our movements more effective.
So let's pick an example from the book, and that's Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring, because I think that's a great example of what you're talking about. Social media was inextricable to the Arab or to the Arab Spring. I happened to be in Cairo a week before all of that went down, and it was interesting talking to cab drivers at the time because I'd be like, "What do you think about Mubarak?" And they'd go, "What can you do?" And we were like, "Oh, you could hang out in Tahrir Square with your 100,000 best friends." And my friend and I left, and we thought, "Oh, that Mubarak will die, in office with no vice president because he didn't want anybody to get any ideas." And but a week after we left, they were able to mobilize, I think it was 100,000 people to Tahrir Square. So it had that that energy to it, and it had
completely.
that spread to it, but then it kind of fell apart. What do you think worked well in that movement, and why didn't it take?
Yeah. Well, I think to me, Arab Spring, especially in Egypt, is the classic example of what I was just describing, which is that, the ability to mobilize people very quickly is an incredible social media provides an incredible tool for that. So it allowed this very new coalition of people, because the organizations and the people and the individuals that came together in Tahrir Square, that was a very new, they were all coming from different parts of Egyptian society, all bearing the same disgruntlement. They were in effect creating a new kind of coalition there. And that wouldn't have been able to happen if you hadn't had a tool that could call everybody down to the street at the same time. So the problem is that they achieved their goal, which is an extraordinary goal. They brought the dictator down, right? I mean, they actually, their sheer physical presence there in that square over, I think it was 18 days, eventually led to his fall. But what happens the next day? The next day, this new coalition that came together in Tahrir Square needs to turn themselves into a viable political opposition party. Right? They need to become, there's going to be democracy in Egypt. Okay, well, if you're a party, what's your platform? How do you figure out your platform? And how do you go and start to convince other parts of Egyptian society that aren't inclined towards your point of view to come along with you? I mean, all the organizing work that needs to happen. And for that, Facebook was terrible, because all it did was it led them down these like alleyways into, where they would fight each other, it had all those features that were so good taking them to the square, but were terrible in allowing them to sort of create a new political identity for themselves that actually could accrue power. On the other hand, they were up against two forces in Egyptian society. One was the Muslim Brotherhood, which had spent the last 25 years in the underground in Egypt. I mean, they had been suppressed. So they had built all those modalities. I mean, they had all that time to understand what their ideology was. They knew exactly what they wanted to do if they ever got power, and who was in charge and who wasn't in charge. And there was cells spread all over the country. So that was a major force to contend with. And then there was, of course, the army, which had, lost its figurehead in Mubarak, but was very ready, with another head to place on top of the decapitated body. They were ready to show who was in power again. So up against those two forces, what you needed a medium that was, if we want to think in terms of what kind of medium is useful, you needed a medium that allowed them to maybe go into a slightly closed room together and start to figure out how they were going to take the next steps. And they just never had that. They never had that. And so not only did kind of social media allow them to go to the square too fast, you could even say, it all happened very, very quickly, but then those same tools were really ineffective in allowing them to build a true political opposition, and they were trampled. I mean, they were just trampled. Yeah.
That makes sense to me, because it seems to me that there's some ratio ideally between emotive and performative versus proactive. So you need some amount of that emotive, performative element. Otherwise, you can't get anybody to your movement, and you can't get anybody excited to do it. But at some point, though, you do need a guy to go, great, we've ousted Mubarak. It's time to talk about sugar subsidies. Like now, we've had an 8% corporate tax rate. I think 7.5% would really juice. And they didn't have that, because they have mostly people that knew how to get retweets and knew how to get memes and things like that, but hadn't actually worked out any type of coherent, which makes us, now that I think about it, the whole thing was oppositional, right? With the exception of the Muslim Brotherhood, you could have 18 different perspectives on what ought to follow. The thing they agreed on was the ousting Mubarak, but there was no coherence afterwards.
Exactly. Which is another feature of social media in a way that, the revolutionaries themselves told me, is it was great for tearing things down. It was not good for building things up. The central character in that chapter is a guy named Wael Ghonim, who kind of became well known at the time. He was
the Google guy.
Called the Google guy. I was going to say the Google guy, right? And so Wael was a guy who nobody could have believed more fervently in the power of social media than Wael. His dream in his life, growing up, he grew up sort of in Egypt, but also outside of Egypt, was to work for Google. And he was a marketing guy for Google. And he's the one who started the Facebook page that kind of helped launch the whole thing. I think most people believe that. what happened, what he experienced through the course of, he was jailed during those 18 days. I mean, it's a long story with him, but he basically came out the other end of it, and was and became a reformer of social media. I mean, he went to Silicon Valley. He had to leave Egypt. He had to exile himself because the situation got so much worse after the revolution. And then he started a social media a company, a new platform, where he was going to try to put in place certain features that would allow people to have have a bias towards real conversation, and that ability to find consensus and sort of build things up, as opposed to what he had seen, which was this kind of tearing down, which had kind of destroyed any hope that he had of changing things.
Yeah, that is the holy grail, that somebody could eventually develop a social media platform that has a network effect and is not just a dive bar where you throw beer bottles at people while sitting on the toilet. That is the dream. So then my follow-up to that question would be, you go through a lot of different movements in the book. You talk about the Chartists. You get into Soviet underground territory with Samizdat. Am I saying that right?
Samizdat, yeah.
Samizdat. And so with the Chartist movement, you've got all these 19th century committees where the Women's Organization of Manchester Workers and the committee for the committee for blokes in Newcastle, and they're all meeting and they're all talking about we would like to work a maximum of 50 hours a week. We've decided 50 hours, whatever the thing is, right? And then with Samizdat, I'm going to just butcher it. Apologies.
Yeah,
you've got this kind of basically underground Zine that's spreading around the Soviet Union, so that there are elements of liberalism that are already there when the fall of the Soviet Union happens. Now that we have social media, are all movements just going to die in the cradle? Like, is social media going to turn everything into a flash in the pan? Do you think that we are capable of working through that? How do you see technology moving, or how do you see reform movements moving forward in our current technological era?
It's a good question. I mean, I actually am not that pessimistic. I feel that activists are learning what social media is good for, what kind of tool it is. I mean, that's been my experience I have a chapter at the end of the book about Black Lives Matter and about a particular group of activists who sort of changed over time in terms of their own strategy, because they had experienced these cycles of enormous attention and then everything sort of falling off, and such that it kind of conditioned them to understand that what they needed to do was build something that was closer to the ground, that was more local. So I do think there is kind of a learning process happening. I mean, the other thing is, I'm not suggesting in this book that we can turn off the internet, because that's clearly not happening. Like, this is our...
Although Mubarak did try that.
Yeah, he did. It's true. He did try that. He did try that. But I think what we need to be is more self-aware about the different kinds of modes of communicating on the internet. And so to the extent that activists can begin to understand that social media, that the big social media platforms, the loud public ones, the ones that are meant for performance, that those have their role, but then we also need our little Signal group or Telegram or whatever, so that we can talk strategy, or we need a chat room on Discord or any one of these, there are other ways that people can communicate, as long as they have a self-awareness that what might be useful in any particular moment is the huddle and not the bullhorn, So that's, I think to the degree that younger people, and I think younger people are getting, more and more savvy about digital communication and not using it sort of brainlessly as we did, who might have come up with it and not really. I think they actually are beginning to understand that it closes certain doors for them if they don't use it properly.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, I basically enjoy discussing policy. I enjoy discussing ideology. I really don't do it much on social media, because I'm aware that you can't hear tone, you can't hear subtext. I might be saying something in a friendly way, you might misinterpret that. Also, it's kind of difficult to be nuanced on 144 characters. And so you just tend to talk in sound bites. So in my end, I have a podcast and I talk to people in person. And those are the two means by which I do political discussions. I really don't do a lot of social media anymore, and I'm not that smart. So I would imagine that a lot of other people have caught on and have gone, okay, this is where I go for cat memes and porn.
Right.
This is where I go for discussing what we do when we get ranked choice voting in.
Right. No, and I think we're all becoming a little bit more savvy about that. I mean, I think even in the course of working on this book, I feel like I've seen a shift, if only because, in the other realms of our life, not political and social change, but, the way we are personally with each other in society, or, the kind of the aspects of our democratic polity, and the things that we feel concerned about, the way that we're dividing, in such extreme ways. We've become super attuned to how social media is exacerbating the bad stuff, and so I think that sensitivity, probably is going to also begin to apply more and more to how people think about movements. It was just also clear to me that somehow this was this realm apart, that people still have in their minds this notion that all you need to make change is for like your hashtag to go viral, and that is even though we've compartmentalized all these different ways that social media is bad for us. But then this one thing, which might be one of the most important things, which is how we change anything in our society. There is still this kind of romanticism about that was the case, back during the Arab Spring, of the kind of Twitter revolution, that if we can just get an idea, a meme to spread wide enough that, it will really change things. And that's sort of what I'm pushing up against, which is let's have the same level of skepticism that we have about these other ways that social media is hurting us for movements and for the process of change happening.
Well, and I'll add a healthy dose of cynicism to that phenomenon of if only we could go viral. I find that kind of in politics, in movements, in just kind of general altruism, people really like doing things that they can get credit for and get emotion for that don't involve any time or money. That is something very popular. Is like, oh, great, right. I can feel slightly outraged, and I can like signal to all of my friends how wonderful I am.
Right.
I don't want to go to the meeting though to discuss zoning reform. I was planning to watch Netflix tonight, and I think that social media sort of allows that. Like you get all the emotional benefits of doing that, but you don't actually have to do anything, and it results in this kind of shallow flash in the pan phenomenon.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for when I look. So half of my book sort of looks historically, right, pre-internet, at these different forms of communication that vanguards had. Let's call them vanguards. When they were starting to come up and to develop a radical idea. And in each one of those pre-internet ones, the analog ones, there was so much hard work involved in just putting those in, making that communication happen. So, you mentioned the Chartists, right? And then that chapter is about petitions, because essentially the Chartist movement was about using there was an enormous working class in England in the 1830s, and increasingly enormous because of industrialization, and they didn't have the right to vote. There was only, in the 1830s, it was 1 in 6 men, they weren't even talking about women yet, had the right to vote. And so they had
property requirements. There were all
exactly.
these. I mean, this is back before universal suffrage. Back when, all that.
Right.
Stuff,
I mean, there was still this idea of England being having these democratic, back to the Magna Carta. But in reality, it was actually quite limited. The franchise was quite limited, and at the same time, you had this working class that was feeling. They had horrid living conditions.
Unions were often illegal, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah,
unions
were
just banned by law.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was, and they had no power at all. I mean, there wasn't even, but there was this one small loophole, and the loophole was that since the 14th century, it had been decreed that any citizen could petition the king and the parliament, for any issue any grievance they had. Nobody had thought to use this on the massive scale that the Chartists had. It was usually for small, land disputes,
right. My neighbor put a fence on my side of the allotment, and I humbly petition Lord Ducklesworth to allow me to remove the fence.
Exactly. But what the Chartists did is they used this ability to petition, their little loophole, to this basically revolutionary purpose, which is they said, let's get as many people as we can from this new newly aware, newly self-conscious working class to sign a petition demanding the right to representation, to political representation. But the work involved with it, so there wasn't actually a self-conscious working class before this Chartist movement began. There were people who were working in awful conditions, but they didn't think of themselves as a working class with certain demands that needed to be met. But what happened is, through the process of trying to accumulate the signatures, this whole world spun out of associations, of local groups. They had newspapers, they had, temperance society. They had all this whole world from this act of going out and trying to collect signatures, which was hard, which was, you had to go door to door, you had to sneak onto factory floors, you had to, set up in different parts of your village or city, to get people to sign. And then you had to convince them. You had to go through a process of standing with somebody and saying, look, this is the reason why, we need to challenge the government on this. And people were scared at first. And then by convincing them, you're beginning to convince yourself. And then maybe they're kind of coming along. And then it ends with this act of them signing, which is, these were people who were moving from illiteracy to literacy. This was, a kind of a solemn act for them. So what I mean to say is that this was hard work. And the hard work of it actually was very productive in terms of building a sense of solidarity and a sense of identity as a working class. So that when this first petition, which is the one I write about in the book, was delivered in 1839, it had 1.3 million signatures on it, which was a huge number of people in England in the 1830s.
There's probably like 6 to 10 million people in England at that time, I'm guessing.
Right. So, and they're laughed out of Parliament. They're not even given the motion to debate the petition was rejected. So, but what they gained was a real cohesive sense of identity as a working class. That process of collecting the signatures, was the thing that sort of bonded them and set them on their path. Because then, there was another petition campaign, and it was a very sort of, it allowed them to sort of become who they were as a movement. And in many of my examples, that's the case. Is it's the hard work of actually finding a way to communicate and be together, that the work put in that is a feature of, what makes it strong and effective.
Well, I think that the Chartists are a great example of that incubation that you're talking about, because they, as you point out, they've got newspapers. They've got a very successful newspaper, and they're arguing with each other in columns about the how long the work week should be, and if we should get rid of the rotten boroughs. I don't know what the various things, but they're nonetheless having internal debate and argument. There's also a sense of internal cohesion. I get the impression that that's something that Fergus O'Connor, the leader of the Chartist movement, was very concerned with. We've got to be careful in not overplaying our hand at certain times, and we don't want to expend our social capital. And he's thinking very strategically in terms of how to have this movement amass and leverage itself, as opposed to just being kind of an angry, reactive, performative thing of we don't like this, let's get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that there's an extreme example of that in that chapter, which is that what Fergus O'Connor is worried about is that if there isn't something like the petition for them to channel their energy into, they're going to devolve into just a violent mob, which is what happens. There is an attempt at a sort of revolutionary in Newport. There's an attempt at sort of a revolutionary uprising that's squashed immediately. Lots of people get killed. The three leaders get, sentenced to, they're almost executed, and they're sentenced to they're sent to Tasmania,
which was bad back then. You didn't.
Which is bad.
Now all of the British people I know are trying to go to Australia. Back then, you didn't want to go to Australia.
But Fergus O'Connor understood that if there wasn't something like the petition to channel their energies, to provide that cohesion, then it would just spin out of control, because these were angry people who wanted to see a change in their lives, and they didn't have any tools to do that. So this was it was critical from that perspective too.
Yeah. So with activist movements, what do you see as kind of the different functions between, say, a movement working in the system like the Chartists, because they're petitioning Parliament. Fergus O'Connor's getting elected to Parliament. they have big problems with the system, but they are attempting to reform the system, as opposed to, say, the Arab Spring, where they're saying the system's illegitimate and horrible. We need to topple the statue. Like, how do they functionally differ in terms of tactics and how they manifest?
That's interesting. I mean, I think in terms of building up to the change they're trying to create, I'm not sure that it's that different. You still need those same closed rooms where you can figure things out, because changing things within a system in some ways is harder, right? You have to understand the levers that you're pulling, how to accumulate power, if it's something that, and where the power is that actually you can push on to get done what you want to get done. All those things also demand a level of this kind of quiet before, right? Now, for revolution, I think maybe the tricky thing there is that it's easy to imagine that it's easy to sort of lean into these big gestures, right? Of, if we just topple the dictator, then it's all over, if we just remove, if we just remove this institution that we hate, then everything will be fine, and so I think it's easy to be seduced by those sort of social media features of the big emotionally satisfying gesture that's going to sort of end the debate. When in reality, we all know that that's not really how it works, So they too need, the ability to gather and to say what's going to happen the next day, even if that is our immediate goal. What's going to happen then? Well, how do we build, not just destroy?
So theoretically, let's say that I'm in a saloon here in Austin, Texas, and I'm hanging out with, I don't know, Andrew Yang, and we're like, man, we want to get ranked choice voting, and we're going to stick it to the man and upend the two-party system and that kind of thing. And we're scheming as to how to we hate first past the polls. I'm picking a specifically wonky technocratic
No.
thing.
I like it.
I'm fired up about it, though. We hate the two past the polls. We don't like the duopoly of the two parties, all that kind of stuff. And we're doing all of this. We're coming up with memes. We're coming up with hashtags. Right. When you slip in and sit down and start drinking your drink with us, like, what advice would you have if to that kind of nascent cell? Like, should we wait a year and just really talk things out until we've got now Yang is the chairman of the X committee, but I'm on the party committee, and Bob's in charge of birthdays and all that. And we're also no, we actually do have a position on what we think of Euclidean zoning ordinances or whatever. Right. Kind of what would you advise a nascent movement?
Look, it's hard because every movement has its own sort of needs, and my intention was more to talk about sort of to describe the conditions under which you develop something that's more sustainable. So I'd say in that situation, what you need to do is understand that delicate balance of you don't just want to stay in the saloon, right? I mean, you don't just want it to be like a debating society. And that's a delicate thing too, is knowing, and you also don't want it to stay just the three of you chatting amongst yourselves. You have to sort of start to bring people in. But, I think there is an interesting process by which, that kind of recruiting begins to happen, because as you're bringing more people in to this, and which is why it's nice to begin small, because the process of bringing people in is actually a process of kind of learning what they want and sort of adjusting your worldview or your set of goals or demands to this increasing number of people, so that it's sort of scaling slowly and not in a huge way. And it's scaling as a result of conversations with people and understanding their needs. The clearest example that's coming to mind from the book of this is, talking to, again, Black Lives Matter activists who, had this idea of abolishing the police, that people online were, they were all in the same camp on this. But in some ways this was theoretical, because once they went out to start to talk to people in their neighborhoods, they found that most people, even in the communities of color that they were, spending their time organizing in, didn't want to get rid of the police. They didn't necessarily like the situation that they were living in in that particular moment, but they definitely didn't think that the police should be abolished. And so what that led to, though, was conversations. You bring in more people, and then you begin to talk. Well, what does a community-led vision of safety look like? What does that look like? What does it look like to you? What would be better? What actually doesn't work for you? So that it's that idea of like, once you're beginning to scale up, like you have to sort of find a way to include more and more people's idea of what the change looks like, into your own. And so I would say some balance of kind of understanding like when the strategizing by yourself needs to sort of move, you need to move beyond that stage, but also making room for other people. So other like-minded people who can help shift and change and refine what you want to achieve.
With the abolish the police, did you see that as a jumping point for good conversations, or is it a negative thing? And I'll preface, from my perspective, George Floyd died, and pretty much everybody in America went, "That's screwed up. That is not okay. We really need to change this stuff."
Right.
And then abolish the police became the hashtag, and then I talked to people, and about half of them went, "No, that's not what it means. It means reform the police." And then the other half was like, "No, it literally means abolish the police." And then a bunch of people went, "Well, I don't want in on this." And so I watched that and was like, you overplayed your hand. We were all on board to do something, and then you went too far and alienated everybody.
But to me, that was a perfect example of how that social media, like metabolism and sort of instinct towards saying the thing that is going to sort of everyone's going to react to.
No, because literally I had a conversation with somebody that was like, "This is a catchier slogan. Like reform the police is less catchy than abolish the police."
And when you talk to the activists, I mean, I'm not going to speak for all the activists, but a lot of the really the people who are deeply embedded in their community, who understand how organizing works, who want to make local change and not just like, gesticulating and trying to like, to gesturing to things, but they actually want to try to change things. They understand that it happens at the city council level. They know that they need to sort of do that old school political organizing. When I talk to those people, again, totally anecdotal, they would say to me that was a kind of a screw up. Like, there is a way to explain what we want. Or what we think would be better for our communities that isn't sort of punitive or doesn't kind of have a tone of let's tear this thing down. But, what if the conversation started with, look, the police departments get funded, they get budgets almost mindlessly in most cities every year. They get the largest share of the budget. And does it really make sense for the police to be the ones who are answering, for example, to somebody who is acting erratically on the street, who might be homeless or mentally ill? Like, wouldn't it make more sense for a social worker to go and deal with that situation? Wouldn't that probably have a better outcome, than if the police went? We're in agreement on that? Fine. Then, like, why shouldn't some of that budget that goes to police go to build up sort of a social services that could handle situations like that? When you start the conversation from that perspective, you're able to bring a lot more people on board. And again, I'm just sort of repeating things that I heard. I think, obviously what happened that summer was incredible just in terms of our ability as a nation to begin to talk about these very hard things that need to be talked about. But my desire, along with these activists, was like, okay, well, let's make it more than just like symbols that end up, getting, and more than just symbolic change, but actually real change that affects people's lives. And the frustration that I heard on the ground were from activists who said, we couldn't, in so many of these cases, we couldn't translate it. We couldn't make it, couldn't make it work. I'll give you just another example, because to me, it dovetails really nicely with the Chartist one. In Minneapolis, there was a group called Black Visions who had sort of experienced these earlier waves of Black Lives Matter, understood how the cycle worked, that there'd be all this attention that would run in 2015, 16. They were the ones at the protests, and then they saw it dissipate. And then so they decided we need to build a different kind of movement, a movement that's smaller, that's, more, that's quicker on its feet, in terms of just getting to know the local politicians. They got people elected to the city council that agreed with them. After that summer, I don't know if you probably remember this, Minneapolis was the city that the city council said we're going to get rid of the police. Right.
Right. Yes, yeah.
And then that didn't happen. It didn't happen because of other political dynamics that are not interesting for this particular conversation. But that same group said, okay, well, we still want to somehow advance this idea. So they tried to get a referendum on that the citizens of the city would be able to vote on this question of whether to get rid of the police. But to get a referendum, they needed I think it was 20,000 signatures on a petition. So they started a petition campaign. This was very much like the Chartists, you know, and all the activists told me that what was interesting was the petition actually gave them the same thing that petition gave people in 1830s, which is an opportunity, a kind of a focal point, a place to say, you know, let's have a conversation about this. You think we need the police? Why do you think we need the police? What do the police do for you? How could it look differently? You know, so it wasn't just a slogan, but actually a conversation. And that referendum did not pass. It got, I think, 44% for and 56% against. But, you know, from their perspective, if change is always incremental, like from 0 to 44% is a pretty big increment. So they managed to actually change people's minds in that city through a petition, you know, through this process of petitioning for this cause.
Interesting. Well, one last question for you, and then we can sign off for today. In going and looking at these various movements that are activists and are trying to create reform, what do you find the internal arguments tend to be over in terms of tactics? Do they have? Are some people trying to work in the system? Some people trying to work out of the system? Are some people saying we should break the law to gain more visibility, and other ones are like, no, that's going to alienate too many of the moderates that we want? Like, what tends to be the push-pull internally in these movements?
I mean, I think what you're describing is the big tension in almost every movement, is this notion of, you know, revolution versus reform, you know, and how quickly can we bring about the change that we want, and does it happen from some kind of big bomb that's dropped in society, you know, in the form of a protest that's going to be bigger than any protest that's ever been seen, or does it happen, you know, by getting people elected, getting a DA elected who agrees with your perspective, you know? That is the big fault line. I guess, you know, I fall on the side of change. It seems to me real change that actually affects society in deep ways always happens incrementally. And so while I think that there is absolutely a place for those big bomb dropping moments, and I would never say that they're not essential in some ways to movements, for the reasons you described before, the kind of emotional reaction that they create, the sense of attachment and excitement. If you've ever been inside of at a protest, you know that feeling of being a part of something. That is really important. But I think that we need to really see, we've lost sight of the other half of that equation, which is, you know, that emotion is only good insofar as it will allow you to then take action. And action has to happen in ways that might feel, from a social media perspective, boring and everyday and incremental and slow. But it's actually the way the world changes.
And that's where I come in as the friendly ombudsman who institutes the way to increase our parking spaces by 15% across the county. Gal Becker, but I very much enjoyed talking to you, and I enjoyed your book, The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.